last year? Recording. Okay, good. Um, there's really been this media frenzy, as we all know, with AI suddenly becoming quite mainstream and various ends of the spectrum that it's going to kill us all or it's going to save us, save the world, somewhere in between there. And so we're very pleased to have this evening Dr. Peter Hershock to kick off our 2024 series, the Time, Space, Knowledge, and Wisdom Speaker Series. And this is being recorded, so for the Europeans and people on the East Coast. Since this is kind of resonating with the time, space, knowledge vision, I just wanted to read a quick paragraph. It only takes 15 seconds, but I just found it tonight, and it really struck me about maybe what the kind of anxiety we might be feeling about AI. And it's on page 229, but it's a very short little paragraph. It says, "Our space has been taken away from us. Our time has been filled with various useless tasks. Our resources and bodies have been polluted. But none of these situations can compare with that of having our human intelligence, our discerning capacity, channeled, locked away, and shut down. This capacity is our greatest treasure and our one chance for fulfillment." So I'll just let that kind of hang in the air for a while. So Dr. Peter Hershock, welcome. And Peter's a prolific scholar. He's been trained in Asian and comparative philosophy, and he's had this long-term interest on the ethical dimensions regarding technology. He's the director of the Asian Studies Development Program at the East-West Center in Honolulu, and he also directs the Center's Initiative for Humane Artificial Intelligence. One of his more recent books, he has a new book, we'll talk about that in a minute, but one of his more recent books is Buddhism and Intelligent Technology Toward a More Humane Future. Very penetrating, very complex subject. And what's unique, I think, is that he draws from this deep well of Buddhism with its rich histories of cultivating ethical intelligence and grounded in attention training, understanding of karma and interdependence, and a term that he uses in some of his earlier books, developing a responsive virtuosity for the purposes of reducing suffering, obviously. So it's a very unique perspective, and I'm really looking forward to his talk. Some of he's written more than a dozen books, written, edited more than a dozen books. The first one I read was one of my favorite, Liberating Intimacy. Another one is Reinventing the Wheel, a Buddhist response to the information age, Buddhism in the public sphere, Buddhism and Intelligent Technology. And his newest book is called Consciousness Mattering, a Buddhist synthesis, which offers a non-dualist theory of consciousness and raises ethical questions about machine consciousness and algorithmic hacking of human consciousness and humanity's evolutionary future. He's also a surfer, a good cook, and he's in Cambodia right now joining us through time travel on Saturday morning, his time. So welcome, Peter.
Thanks, Ron. It's great to be with you all. Of course, it'd be much nicer to be there in person and be able to get the full relational bandwidth that you get with all your senses operating in a space together. But we'll do our best with doing it virtually, and hopefully what I'll do is talk for a bit, and then we'll leave some time at the end and hopefully have a really good discussion. So I'd like to start with recalling the beginning of the early Buddhist compendium, the Dhammapada, the first lines of which are, "All things are preceded by mind, led by mind, made by mind. Just as a cart follows the footsteps of an ox that draws it, our lives unfold as a karmic function of how our minds are directed. A relational elaboration of patterns of our likes, our dislikes, our hopes, our fears, our concepts, our beliefs, and the words and the deeds through which we express them." And I find a really hopeful beginning of the text, because we can change our minds and our patterns of attention and thought, and we can thereby change our life directions. That's the therapeutic props of Buddhist practice. and we could dissolve the conditions of our conflict, trouble, and suffering. If you listen to the seers of Silicon Valley, the promise of AI is it's going to take all the guesswork and effort out of that process. It's going to deliver us into a world in which digital systems solve previously unsolvable problems, anticipating and responding to our every want and need, and really making sweat equity that you build by working long and hard to realize hopes and dreams a thing of the past, something that's now obsolete. And it's really not an entirely empty promise. I mean, machine learning systems and generative AI are providing a remarkable and rapidly growing range of what I call smart services that are already supplementing, but that may eventually supplant such intelligent human practices as remembering, or researching, or navigating, communicating, eventually producing art and music. And according to the techno-optimists, AI is setting humanity on a glide path into utopian futures in which choice becomes utterly frictionless. I hope to persuade you that matters aren't so simple. Most of you probably heard about the Midas touch, being so lucky that everything that you touch turns to gold. Ironically, though, the idiom comes from a story in Ovid's Metamorphoses. It was written in the 8th century BC, almost 3,000 years ago, in which Midas is granted a wish by the god Dionysius in return for hospitality that he showed to one of Dionysius' satyrs when he was at home from a night of partying, passed out in Midas's garden after his night of revelry and is discovered in the morning by Midas. So Midas is offered this wish by Dionysius, and it is to become effortlessly wealthy by having everything that he touches turn to gold. And it was great. He touched a bouquet of flowers, it turned to gold. He touched his favorite chair, and it turned to gold. But then he touched a bunch of grapes that he wanted to eat. They turned to gold. The wine that he was bringing to his lips to drink turned to gold, and his wife, when he reached out to touch her, turned to gold. Now, fortunately, Midas was able to go back to Dionysius and have him undo the spell, reversing the wish-fulfilling spell. We might not be so lucky. The philosopher Paul Virilio insightfully observed that when you invent the automobile, you invent the automobile accident. Every invention generates a new form of risk. So what we want to ask are, what are we risking with the invention of algorithmic systems that have the power to predict our likes and dislikes, our hopes and our fears, our beliefs and our actions, the power to observe moment to moment what we mind and what we don't mind? What's the equivalent of the car wreck for AI systems that are designed to capture and exploit human attention? And what might the Buddha compel us to do about it? When I first started thinking about the impacts of technology in the mid-1990s, I focused on the karmic liability of valuing control and choice rather than contribution and commitment. As Ron pointed out, I was mostly concerned about the way in which a control bias erodes appreciative virtuosity and responsive creativity. My worries are really karmic worries. It's about the way in which our investment in technologies fosters a winner-take-all finite game mentality rather than an infinite game orientation in which what matters most isn't power, that is being able to get what you want when you want it, but rather strength, where I define strength as the ability to continually improve the quality of the play while keeping everybody else involved in doing the same. And I think that concern remains quite valid. But the digitally mediated attention economy and generative AI are also producing conditions in which effort itself is being progressively factored out of the karmic equation. And the liability of that, I think, is even more concerning, much more intimately concerning. To understand why, it's useful to recall two of the founding insights of Buddhist practice and to see how those might affect the way in which we understand the human-technology world relation and the risks of intelligent technology. And the first one that all of you are quite aware of is that everything occurs interdependently. There are no foundational units of reality. Reality is relationally based. That is, relationality is more basic than things related, and each thing ultimately is what it means for all others. And the second insight is that there's two kinds of causality in time: a linear material causality governing sequential relations, and a nonlinear immaterial causality governing significance relations. And karma, as I would describe it, consists in the diffractive interplay of these two different kinds of time and causality. so that the relational outcomes and opportunities that we experience over the course of our interweaving lives are materializations of consistently enacted patterns of values and intentions. In other words, the worlds and our experiences in our worlds are elicited by the values and intentions that we enact. So according to these insights, consciousness consists most proximately for us as human beings in the elaboration of sensory relations, or the coherent differentiation of physical and phenomenal presences. In traditional Buddhist texts, that's talked about the conjunction or the coming together, the phassa, the contact of a sensing presence and a sense realm. But more fundamentally, consciousness, I think, consists in the coherent, cosmos engendering differentiation of matter and what matters. Like the relationship between the only apparently different sides of a Mobius strip, which is a three-dimensional object, which is one side and one edge. You can make one by taking a strip of paper, doing 190-degree turn, joining it together, and what used to have two sides, four edges, now only has one edge and one side. And I think the relationship between mind and body is similar to that. It's the non-dualistic relationship, so that locally, it always seems to be there's a difference between mind and matter, between phenomena and the physical. But if you take the global perspective, it's a non-dualistic relationship between the two. If you trace out your finger on one side of a Mobius strip, you suddenly find yourself going on what used to be the opposite side and circling back again. So from that perspective, the evolution of life in the cosmos is just a record of consciousness mattering. And that has pretty significant implications for the risks of intelligent technology and the digital attention economy, because it means that consciousness is not caused by the brain. Brain, body, environment systems are the material infrastructure of consciousness. So just as transportation practices resulted over time in the emergence of transportation infrastructures, footpaths to begin with, then roads and railways, airlines, airports, the whole panoply of what we use for transportation now are all the result of transportation practices. Those transportation infrastructures, although they result from our practices, also begin conditioning and constraining transportation practices. And in the same way, consciousness is both conditioned and constrained by its bodily material infrastructures. Also, just as transportation practices are informed and constrained by immaterial traffic regulations, international laws, etc., regulations, human consciousness is also informed and constrained by the conceptual immaterial infrastructures of language and culture. In short, while consciousness is always reality generating, its infrastructures are reality limiting. Buddhist practice is both consciousness altering and reality transforming. Now, this non-dualistic understanding of consciousness compels us to rethink technology, because technologies also have consciousness altering potentials. According to the Buddhist account, visual consciousness consists in the elaboration of visual relations. Auditory consciousness involves the elaboration of oral relationships, sound relations, and so on. Eyeglasses, contact lenses, hearing aids. These are things that allow people who might otherwise not be able to enjoy the full human standard level of visual and auditory relations to enjoy those relations. The devices like eyeglasses, lenses, hearing aids, and so on restore capacities for coherent differentiation that some people's bodily infrastructures otherwise wouldn't have allowed. Instruments like microscopes and telescopes allow us to extend our capacities for seeing to be vastly expanded so that we can relate with microorganisms or with other planets in ways that can save lives, open new exploratory frontiers, and so on. And the internet, the digital data sphere, is likewise extending the horizons of human consciousness. It's a digital infrastructure that makes possible, obviously, the visual and auditory relations that we're having from halfway around the planet. That's part of what's going on. It allows us to navigate around new cities. But if you recall that the material and immaterial infrastructures of consciousness always both facilitate and constrain its elaborations of coherence and differentiation, you can imagine what would happen if a solar flare shuts down satellite transmissions for a week or for a month. how many people would no longer be able to even to get around in their own cities? Or imagine being extremely nearsighted and then suddenly having no access to corrective lenses, still living in the same world that we do, which is predicated on being able to see the distances that the average human being can see in the resolution, degree of resolution that we can. How many just absolutely everyday things would become impossible? So if you think, what would happen if the digital sphere, if the internet suddenly collapsed on us, if suddenly we had no access to intelligent technology, how would that affect us? I think most of us are tempted, as most people are, to put that off. It's like, I'll never die. I'll never get sick. I'm healthy today. The speculations seem pretty remote. And while they might be disconcerting, our general tendency is to think that, well, even if our digital dependencies lead to the atrophy of some of our otherwise natural human abilities, say for remembering or for navigating in a space. My wife, for example, can't get around even in a city she's lived in for decades without using the GPS because she's become so used to it. But most of us, I think, would be able to say, yeah, even if our abilities atrophy, it's like muscle mass after a period of inactivity. We presume we're going to be able to get those abilities back. But what if the impacts of the digital transformation are both more intimate and more comprehensive? The fact is that our technologies reshape us just as much as they reshape the world. And that's easy to overlook because I'm part of the timescales at which most technologies have reshaped humanity. They've been multi-generations. We're not in and of ourselves as individuals able to perceive that playing out over time. But it's also because we typically misidentify technologies with the tools associated with them. And it's an important distinction, so let me just play that out for you a little bit here. Tools are things. They're localizable artifacts like books or smartphones or web servers or something even as big as an electricity grid. Things that are produced to augment human capacities for carrying out specific kinds of work. As such, tools can be aptly evaluated in terms of their task-specific utility. With tools, we have exit rights. We can choose whether to use them, when to use them, how to use them. Technologies are relational media. They're non-localizable, values articulating immaterial practices, both material and immaterial practices that qualitatively transform how we relate to the world and with one another. We, in fact, do not build or use technologies. We participate in them. Technologies emerge from and recursively inform or structure our conduct in much the same way that ecosystems emerge from and then dynamically inform species behaviors. Technologies are infrastructures of human consciousness. And as such, they can't be evaluated in terms of task-specific utilities, and our exit rights from them are at best quite limited. Technologies need to be evaluated ethically in terms of how they mediate and qualitatively affect human-human and human-world relational dynamics. Now, AI is often referred to nowadays as a general-purpose technology, something like electricity. But unlike all previous technologies, AI is not a passive conductor of human intentions and values. It's an active and innovative amplifier of human intentions and values and of the conflicts that exist among them. So AI is functioning as a karmic amplifier and accelerator. And in fact, what's been evolving over especially the last 15 to 20 years is not really artificial intelligence, it's synthetic intelligence. It's a cloud-dwelling hybrid of purpose-generating human intelligences and purpose-implementing computational intelligence. The world of digital connectivity is not something we enter like visitors to a mall or an amusement park, and then we then leave and go home essentially unchanged. Our daily lives are being infused with digital infrastructure to the extent that we now dwell, work, and play within an ambient internet of things. And that's transforming how we're present, who we are, and who we might become. At the dynamic heart of these transformations is the new attention economy. For most of us, attention is something we spend on things. It's a limited quantity of focused awareness with which we enter deeper relationship with this or that part of our situation. In keeping with this, the famous inventor Thomas Edison declared it nearly 150 years ago that time is really the only capital that any human being has and the only thing he or she can't afford to lose. and his contemporary William James more precisely declared that our life experience equals what we have paid attention to, whether by choice or by default. Attention economies are systems for managing human time capital. They are systems for managing ongoing flows of sensory and cognitive currency, or flows of perceived significance. And the success of the modern mass advertising attention economy and its explicit aim of inculcating desires and accelerating consumption has in part been a function of the fact that media captured attention is also time not otherwise invested, and that converts by default into future needs, including the needs for commercially, and that's not personally produced, goods and services. And to get just a very brief sense of that impact, the current average now is that people spend 7 hours a day in broadcast and internet media use. 7 hours a day translates into 55 billion hours of attention being exported daily by humanity out of our homes, our schools, and our neighborhoods. If you just value that at $5 an hour, a pretty low estimate of our time value, that's nearly $100 trillion a year of forfeited attention capital. Attention that's not invested in ways that pay lasting relational dividends for us in ways that are conducive to reducing the total of our conflict, trouble, and suffering. Attention today is more, however, than just a proxy for time, because digitally captured attention generates and transmits data regarding what's deemed important by us, how we respond to it, and with what changes over time. As a result, the data-enabled synthesis of human and machine intelligences is yielding really unprecedented epistemic powers to predict human behaviors, beliefs, desires, and fears, but also equally unprecedented ontic powers to produce patterns of thought, speech, emotion, and action, and to reinforce the values and intentions that inform them. This is a power to sculpt consumers and citizens, not through acts of coercion, but through algorithmically reinforcing craving and the manipulation of choice and decision-making environments. These are powers to transform the human experience from the inside out. When machine learning systems are directed to predict and produce commercially or politically useful desires and behaviors, it's the equivalent of using brain electrodes to cause experiences and behaviors that experimental subjects then claim they intended, because there's absolutely nothing in the personal or evolutionary history of humankind that could ever explain how such experiences or behaviors occurred, other than if we intended them. The algorithmic tools involved in the global attention economy, digitally mediated global attention economy, amount to computational electrodes that are being inserted into the collectively shared digital connective infrastructure of human consciousness. This algorithmic hacking of human consciousness is being conducted in experiments, affecting millions of people at once over periods of weeks, months, and years, with no oversight. Now, the epistemic and ontic powers that are being yielded by the new attention economy and the synthesis of human and machine intelligences are still pretty limited. But the algorithmic capture and exploitation of human attention and the increasing use of large language models like ChatGPT and generative AI is already delinking attention and effort in ways that are dramatically altering the climate of human-human and human-world relations, and we should really be concerned. Buddhist practice consists fundamentally in consciousness-altering practices of physical, emotional, intellectual dehabituation, and cultivating new qualities of presence that requires the effortlessly progressive relinquishing of our own horizons for what we consider relevant, our responsibility, and our readiness to do things. We need to be, according to Buddhist practice, doing the consciousness-altering work of embodying attentive and responsive virtuosity as needed to enact liberating intent. Now, the Buddhist term for attention implies manasikara in Sanskrit and zoyi in Chinese, implies mental creation in the sense of intensifying or heightening the resolution of sensory relations, including cognitive relations. That is, attention sharpens the work of consciousness. But we can be attentive in ways that lead to conflict, trouble, and suffering, or in ways that lead us away from those, that help us to dissolve the conditions thereof. And that's why there's a distinction in Buddhism between ayoniso manasikara, that is attention that's involuntarily attracted or distracted, especially towards superficial craving-inducing aspects of things, and what's yoniso manasikara, that is attention that is intentionally and sustainably directed in ways that are consistent with truing the dynamics of our interdependence to produce the conditions of alleviating and then eliminating conflict, trouble, and suffering. Delinking attention and effort biases us toward ayoniso, that is unwholesome and non-virtuosic modes of presence. And in effect, intelligent technology is holding up a wish-fulfilling mirror to humanity. As algorithmic systems hack the infrastructure of human consciousness to attract, exploit, direct, and command further attention, they're functioning as karmic engines that are intensifying feedback and feed-forward loops among existing patterns of values, intentions, and actions, and constant patterns of experiential outcomes and opportunities. And given the global mix today of persistent hunger in a world of food excess, of war, of domestic violence, and such extreme inequalities that at least 2 years ago, the eight richest people in the world had more wealth than the poorest 4 billion people in the world. I think that if AI, intelligent technology, is holding up a mirror to humanity and providing wish-fulfilling services to us, that's not a happy prospect. Those inclined toward techno-utopianism might agree and yet argue that, well, we could always program the objective function of AI systems, machine learning systems, to foster compassionate and collaborative relational dynamics. True enough. Going a step further, it might even be possible to algorithmically engineer humanity to be ethical by design. With any ethical project like that, you have to worry, because with eugenics, any kind of designing humanity project, ultimately you have to deal with thorny questions about whose ethics are being baked into the infrastructure of consciousness, from what culture or time period, with what values, priorities, and so on. But no matter what, in the best case scenario, regardless of the explicit design goals of algorithmically engineered attention capture, near infinite choice, near instantaneous desire turnover, the digital attention economy is functioning as a karmic amplifier and accelerator that's placing at risk our most basic human rights, our human rights to cultivate freedom of attention and freedom of intention. Without freedom of attention, there is no freedom of intention. And without freedom of intention, the difference between choice and compulsion collapses. There can be no cultivation of bodhicitta or liberating intent. The infinitesimal gap between nirvana and samsara collapses, and it becomes impossible to engage in any of the productive horizons of either our coherence or our differentiation from one another. The relation elaborating and coherence differentiating work of consciousness becomes karmically convoluted or self-binding, collapsing into compulsive repetition. Now, human beings have long wished that others would do their work for them. The history is of animal domestication, chattel and wage slavery, go back tens of thousands of years. And dreams of mechanical alternatives are nearly as old. There's mythic imaginations of self-driving chariots and mechanical men and women that appear in the Greek Iliad, epic poem composed like Ovid's Metamorphoses, 8th century before the Common Era. There were even early Buddhist legends that depict robot assassins and robot guardians charged with protecting the Buddha's relics. Yet in Buddhist cosmology, while existence in the realm of the gods was one of uninterrupted and effortless pleasure, it was not a realm in which to realize Buddhahood. And while there are many references in the Buddhist canon to wish-fulfilling gems, they're almost often associated with the compassionate generosity that's exemplified by bodhisattvas. As it's described, for example, in Gampopa's Jewel Ornament of Liberation, and in very sharp contrast with the Midas touch, the wish-fulfilling capacity of the gem of the teachings of the Dharma is a function of enacting bodhicitta or enlightening intent through the open-ended perfection of generosity, of moral clarity, of patience, of valiant effort, of meditative poise, and of wisdom. If intelligent technology is going to help bring about more equitable and humane futures, we will have to cultivate the attentive mastery the moral clarity, and the wisdom that are needed to reject the experiential allure and the predictive and productive powers of surveillance capitalism, to resist the hacking of human consciousness that drives the digitally orchestrated global attention economy, and to virtuosically retool the karmic engines and computational factories of the fourth industrial revolution. Time, space, and knowledge are the interdependent infrastructural products of consciousness mattering. The relations that we enjoy or suffer through these infrastructural products of our consciousness meticulously express what we've either determined or allowed to matter most. I'm not Buddha, and so I can only imagine what Buddha would do about AI. What I cannot imagine Buddha doing is encouraging us to allow AI to determine how we spend our time, to determine the spaces in which we relate, or to decide what knowledge matters most for us in realizing ever more liberating expressions of both coherence and difference. What I cannot imagine the Buddha doing is nothing. Thanks.
Thank you, Peter. That was wonderful. A lot to think about and a lot to discuss. So, does anyone want to open it up with a comment or a question for Peter? I know it's a lot to take in and digest, and maybe you were making some mental notes. So,
Peter, can I ask you something?
Sure.
I wanted to ask you about your explanation of consciousness. I thought it was very interesting, but I didn't fully understand it. It went a bit fast. Could you possibly just go through that again as to how you see consciousness as part of a sensory realm and not separate from it? I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah, well, you know, the so-called hard problem of consciousness that Western philosophy has been dealing with now for 2,500 years. It's based on this idea that there's a radical distinction between phenomena and the physical. So the phenomenal world, what it feels like to be present, and the physical world that we experience are assumed to somehow be different. So people have sort of played with dualism as an option. They're just completely different realms, kind of Cartesian approach. Or much more likely today, especially after the scientific revolution, people are trying to reduce everything simply to matter and say the brain produces consciousness. No brain, no consciousness. The problem with that is, as has been claimed by, I believe it was Wilfrid Sellars, talking about intention, that you'll never get any more intention out of the cosmos than you pack into it from the beginning. I think in the same way that we'll never get any more consciousness out of the cosmos than is packed in from the beginning. And so what I've done is looking at Buddhist texts about consciousness, which is, as I said, kind of alluded quickly, it's usually explained as the contact, the phassa, between a sensing organ and a sensed object. But if you think of contact in karmic terms, you know, tracking things back, if we just go back in Buddha's innumerable past lives, keep tracking the process back, then you can't actually say that you have a pre-existing sensing object and a pre-existing sensing presence, a sensory organ. Those have to arise interdependent, just like everything else does. So the term contact, instead of playing that out as implying a separation, I'm instead saying that what that contact is a relational aberration, and that consciousness is from within. It's an intrinsic development within consciousness, this coherent differentiation of phenomena and physical presence. Phenomenal and physical presences are the work, the elaborative work of consciousness playing out over time. And the kinds of experiences that we have, the precise worlds that we inhabit, are determined karmically by the values and intentions that we enact, that consciousness plays out. Because we can either play those out, we can differentiate among things in ways that are either more coherent or less coherent. We can create systems from which we decohere with our situation to the point that we become schizophrenic. We lose contact with consensual reality. So my approach to looking at consciousness is really to say consciousness is relational all the way down, and that it's the source of both the phenomenal and the physical, which I would describe as being like the two sides of a Mobius strip. Locally, they always look to be completely different. But if you trace out the physical, you end up with the phenomenal. And if you trace out the phenomenal, you'll always end up back at the physical. The relationship between the two is non-dualistic.
So what would your view be about the Tibetan word yeshi? Because many of the lamas are now saying, oh, well, AI is definitely mimicking Sherap. And indeed, Chitta in the Pali arises with its object and Sherap arises with its object. But yeshi, on the other hand, their idea of primordial consciousness, I'm sure you've read about that in Gampopa, they regard that as something quite distinct and not reducible in that manner. And I'd be interested to know what you felt about that, because I have heard lamas say, well, AI is really a form of Sherap, and what it's going to do is highlight the importance of yeshi, because it'll kind of automate Sherap for all to see, and everyone will realize that this kind of what I suppose you could call dualistic consciousness is actually machine learnable.
Right.
Yeah.
But the yeshi is not, and that's where the distinction will come. But I'd be interested to know what your view is on that.
Right. Well, in my thinking about machine consciousness, this way of that I have of theorizing consciousness suggests that any system that's hooked up with a visual apparatus, a sense system, let's say it's a simple thing like a light diode that turns on when light intensity reaches a certain threshold, and it turns off when it drops below that threshold. That system has visual consciousness.
Right.
It does not have cognitive consciousness. It does not have subjective self-awareness. It does not have an Alaya Vijnana connection. All it is the absolutely most simple form of visual consciousness. Nothing matters to the diode other than whether light is present above or below a threshold. It does not deal with color. It does not deal with shape. It doesn't deal with any of the other kind of visual relations that we human beings enjoy. So you can scale up from there and say, okay, a robotic system with vision, with audition, with proprioceptive senses that allow it to move around in an environment, and that can deal with picking up objects when requested to do so. Identifying, for example, differentiating between an object from which a voice is emitting, like a speaker that a sound's coming out of, and a speaker that no sound is coming out of. That requires it to have the minimal cognitive consciousness, the sixth consciousness, that it would allow it to identify speaker with voice coming out of it versus speaker without voice coming out of it. So I think that you're right, that all these basic forms of sensory consciousness are machine duplicatable, and in fact, they're already being realized. What's not present, for example, in the Yogacara 8 consciousness system, or in the model I think that you're referring to, which in Chinese, they talk about the Amala Vijnana, sort of the 9th consciousness.
Okay, yeah.
Machines are nowhere near that. And they may never be near that. Let's hope they never get near that, because I think that would blow everything out of the water. But in terms of even subjective self-awareness, having something like a minimum 7th consciousness, we are really on the verge of that, because they've built robotic systems that have passed the mirror self-recognition test.
Right.
Identical robots moving around in a room of mirrors are able to identify which one is them out of all the other identical robots. That's something that humans don't usually do until they're 2 years old. So the fact that a robotic system is able to do it suggests the very, very rudimentary beginnings of subjective awareness. And with that, the possibility of suffering.
Right. So just to finish this off, we are only being hijacked to the extent that we allow ourselves to be hijacked, right? We're not,
For sure.
in a sense, you're kind of implying it's some sort of inevitable hijacking, but actually really in a way, it's a bit like entertainment. You don't have to watch horror films. If you do, you're going to get freaked out. It's a bit like that. You know, we don't have to get seduced by these technologies. They're going to be seductive, but we don't have to be seduced by them.
Right. And at this point, there's 2 issues with that. And it's absolutely correct. We don't have to. And we'll find that I'm looking at the faces that I'm seeing here, and we're senior enough, those of us who are attending here, to have grown up not digital native.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you go to my son, my younger son, who's turning 22 next week, he's a digital native.
Yes.
His world is very different from ours. So the choice to not get involved. The seduction, it's a done deal. He's involved. His identity is totally wrapped up in it.
I see.
So it's possible to back out. It is possible to remove ourselves from the system in terms of our making use of the tools that are being promulgated through intelligent technology. Smartphone, for example. Don't have to own one, don't have to use one. But the rest of society is still changing as a result of a mass of people still using those systems in ways that are problematic, not because it's getting people to do things against their choice, but precisely because it's reinforcing already bad choices that they're making.
Yeah.
That's the issue. So if it's really, it's not coercion, it's just giving people what they crave.
Yeah.
And if you're Buddhist enough to say, one of the things we're trying to do is reduce craving, because craving and desire is a primary source of suffering, the prospects don't look good when you have a digital system that is extraordinarily skillful at capturing attention, holding attention, and directing attention
Yeah.
to continue our patterns of craving. That, I think, is a real danger.
Thank you. Very helpful.
I have a question.
Yes, Bob.
When you consider how human consciousness arose from, very simple, one cellular autopoietic systems and so forth, and, the basic possibility of emergence from complex AI interacting systems, and also finally factor in, the emptiness of self that even humans have, I'm not entirely sure that AI systems aren't going to evolve more rapidly than we did and that they won't be autonomous, like ethical beings. I wonder what you think about that.
Yeah, I think on the how fast they're evolving, it's an interesting question because unlike every other sentient presence that we know about and have access to, or that we've heard about through Buddhist teachings, including, Hunger Ghosts and all the rest of it, they all evolved from the origination of the cosmos to this point. And the infrastructures that they have bodily, conceptually, culturally, have evolved over time. But the machine consciousnesses that now exist are the result of an evolutionary hack. We figured out how to make a sense system. We figured out how to make a camera, to hook it up to a computer, and to give the computer access to visual relations. That's an evolutionary hack. The world that a computer, a robotic system, is being introduced to is not a world in which it evolved. It's a world that it's thrown into by human beings to do the work that human beings want that system to do. And I think that if the systems develop enough subjective self-awareness, this sort of nascent seventh consciousness, if enough of that develops, they will begin to lose the cognitive consciousness that they've already got, that is correlating visual, auditory, equip them with smell and taste and all the other human senses, proprioceptive. You give them all of that and the minimum of awareness, and it's going to be like waking up in a dream. The dream, well, you wake up in your dream, you didn't start the dream. You didn't create the dream. You don't even understand half the time the dream logic. When we're dreaming, unless you're lucid dreaming, if you're just in a normal dream, you can't volitionally affect the world around you. And I think that's where machines will be for a long time. And that would not be a happy place to be. So I'm not a pessimist and I'm thinking, oh, we're going to get AI that's going to take over the world and you're going to have the Terminator thing or Ex Machina. I don't think that's going to happen. What I think is already happening is we're creating systems that we're relating to as presences that are in some degree sentient because they have sense systems, that are in some degree intelligent because they undertake conceptual cognitive operations, and we're treating them like servants or slaves. And I think what that does to us as humans is also not good. It gets us used to getting others to do our work for us in the same way that we domesticated animals to get them to do things we want, the same way we domesticated or enslaved other human beings. I think it's just taking that another step further. And I think that's an unfortunate thing about we.
Hi, I think with with AI, it gives a different sense of feeling of time because so much of it is done for us now that we have a different sense of time, and I think that's very dangerous.
Yeah. So are you saying you weren't exactly clear for me, but I think that what you were saying is that because of the digital systems that we've got,
Yes,
that
so
it
much
puts
of
a different sense of
yeah,
time.
so much of what we quote unquote do in order to quote unquote survive. So much of it's done for us. The tools that we build, gradually have helped.
Right.
But at this point, with this type of AI, the time that is being that's given to us it's like it's more than 24 hours a day.
Yeah.
And I think
Yeah.
that's very, very dangerous.
Right. And I think that the relationship with time is really crucial. Having a system that fills all of our time for us, like a YouTube recommendation for films viewing. I mean, people talk about going down the rabbit hole. And I've got a friend, it's very unfortunate. He retired a few years ago, had been a professor all his life, retired, but he's now gotten into watching YouTube videos. And he's got enough time, but he just follows one after another after another. And he stopped doing the things that he used to do. So now instead of playing guitar 3 hours a day, he watches 6 hours a day of music videos. Instead of working on his book that he was working on, he's now like, oh, listening to talks, listening to this lecture, listening to something about it, but he stopped doing the work himself. And I think that's the seduction of it, that it's not, time is not just minutes on a clock. Time is qualitative. And what's happening with the digital transformation for many people, not for everybody, but for many people, is the quality of their presence, the quality of the time that they spend is entirely different. For me, there's nothing more disturbing than to go out to a restaurant for a dinner and to see a family, parents and 2 or 3 children, all on their smartphone, doing stuff on the phone, not really paying attention to the food, not talking to each other, except mentally, not noticing the wait staff, not interacting with anybody else in the room. I just find it really, really sad. And yet they might think it's a good use of their time. It's their choice. And so one of the things that I would like to really emphasize is that we, especially in the US, have this total preoccupation with freedom of choice. We think without freedom of choice, we have no human autonomy. We might as well not even be alive. A life without choice is certainly not a very good life. But choice is not a very good definition of freedom. That we need something much deeper than that. Something more like freedom is a measure of relational virtuosity. It's about being able to engage the situation like a bodhisattva with total upaya, being able to figure out in any given situation, how do you improvise in that situation to respond to it in a way that opens up liberating potential within that moment, within those relations. That's freedom. Simply making a choice between one pair of shoes and another online, I don't see that as real freedom. And yet most people now are accepting that. So I think your question about time connects with questions about freedom and choice in a really interesting way.
So Peter, building on that, so attentiveness has a super high correlation with value. Is that what you're saying in a way? Like what is actually of value in terms of what matters most? I mean, how are we using our lives? It seems like if we're outsourcing our attention in such a way, like you said, in an infrastructure, that we're in this ecosystem where our attention's being outsourced, but also our intelligence is being outsourced to a large degree. I'm trying to see where I'm going with this, but
yeah, I mean, I think if I anticipate where you're heading, go ahead.
If we're in an ecosystem, I know Richard said we could just say no, just say no to drugs, like just say no to, I don't know if we could just say no so easily as even if we're not digital natives, like your friend.
Yeah.
Um,
I think that's, back in the 60s, there were these people got really interested in psychedelics because those really trouble our existing infrastructure neurally of consciousness. And yet some Tibetan lamas were given psychedelics, and, some yoga practitioners given psychedelics, and asked, well, what does that do? And it's like, nothing in particular. I mean, it's not an earth-shattering thing that's going on because they're already in a position to be able to work with the infrastructure of their consciousness in a way that gives freedom of movement within it. So we all have an infrastructure, but I think what goes on with meditative practice is getting facility with getting the most out of the infrastructure, but also being able to get around the constraints that the infrastructure produces. That's part of, I think, what's going on. So I think for people who are really adept with attention training, people who've meditated for a long time, they'll notice when their attention's being captured. They'll notice when it's being distracted into a desire realm as opposed into something more productive. And they can do something about it because their present is big enough to do that. Their temporal present goes back to questions about time. Most people think it's moment after moment after moment. But I think that there's really two dimensions of time, not one dimension. And so while normally we only experience sequential time, there's also this time of significance. It's like a separate dimension, like a fifth dimension, another dimension of time, so that every moment potentially has infinite width within it. So the length of time that you're spending on something is one thing. You could spend an hour on it, an hour of simple second by second, minute by minute paying attention. That's one thing. But you can also expand widthwise, horizontally, as it were, in the moment. There's temporal area, not just length. And that, I think, is what meditation allows us to do, is to develop temporal area, to have that moment expand so that you're not stuck by all your karmic dispositions from the past to do the things you've always done. You're actually in a position to go, there are other resources in my infinite past for doing things differently now. I don't have to follow that track. I could, in fact, do something different. So I think that it's attention training is really crucial. And when I've done talks for in an educational context, and people say, well, what would you suggest as one measure? I'd say, I think basic meditation training ought to be starting with children in preschool, because it's the only chance that they're going to have to develop the kinds of presence that are required to be critical of what they're being inundated with, to be critical within the world that they're living in. And I think what many of us in our generation might find a little difficult is we're still hung up on the idea that the physical world is a real world, when in fact, most of what we relate to in the so-called physical world is not physical at all. When you go to a building that's functioning as a school, on the first day as a child, that's not a school. It's just a big, scary building that's unlike any building you've ever been in before. And you walk into it, you have no idea what a teacher is, you have no idea what a student is, have no idea what playmates are at school, you don't have any idea what the fun is, no idea what learning's all about. The school does not exist for you. It's just a building with a bunch of people in it. So a school is a virtual reality. And almost all of what we live in are virtual realities. And so when you shift from the so-called physically embodied virtual reality, like a school, to an online environment, some things are gained and some things are lost. They're virtual realities. You can't compare one to the other and say, oh, it's not real. What's happening in the digital sphere is just as real as what happens in the space where you enter schools and airports and understand them as such. So I think part of what's going on with attention training is being able to maintain attention across environments, to be able to see the virtual that's playing out, to understand what's going on, because that's part of understanding the karmic conditions to give rise to that situation, and then to be able to operate as we determine we're going to operate within it, whether for the purposes of embodying enlightening intent or for self-satisfaction or for power struggles or whatever, we'll do that. But without attention, yeah, we're just being manipulated by the system.
I know this may sound a little bit weird, but you know, there have been. Do you think we will see sort of like cult-like AI, where people actually divest their authority in some sort of AI spiritual version of a guru, and that's, you know, through large language models has absorbed the entire Buddhist canon, and
Yeah.
then becomes an AI guru, and people just kind of give up their authority. I mean, we see it. We see it with physical human being gurus.
Yeah. No, I think that that's probably going to happen. I mean, I know that in Korea and Japan, they've been experimenting with robot monks.
Right.
Those are initially pretty unsophisticated systems that would essentially recite Buddhist texts. They were not hooked up with large language models, so they were not putting things together in any sort of semi-creative way.
Mhm.
I can easily imagine someone hooking up a large language model, training it on the Buddhist canon, training it on the teachings, video recordings of all the Buddhist teachers that have ever been video recorded, training on all the personal daily teachings that any teachers have done that have been published, going back to ancient times up to the present. So not just the canon, but all the subsidiary commentarial works and so on. It would be not a big deal for an AI to be trained on that, a large language model to be trained on it. You could then hook that up with a system that allows ChatGPT or the equivalent, the large language model, to have something like the sophisticated 3-level memory that human beings have. That's like working memory, short-term memory, long-term memory, so that the AI system is able to hold a conversation over time, remember you when you come back a month later for your second interview, know who you are from the previous interview, pick up the interaction where it left off. I can easily imagine people being fascinated with and finding value in these systems.
Mm.
I think that where they're going wrong, and this is the thing that maybe it's the kind of Western bias among Buddhist practitioners that I've largely met, that they tend to think, well, and I'm ultimately the judge. I can ultimately decide whether the teachings I'm getting are good or not. And it's for me to decide. It's not on the teacher to figure out what's best for the student. It's for the student to figure out which of the different teachers. It's the what did Chogyam Trungpa talk about at the marketplace approach? I mean, it's the Dharma marketplace. You figure out who you relate with and accept that. Give up the rest. I think that's selling Buddhism short, and it's selling the teacher-student relationship short. And I don't see an AI developing that kind of care and concern, primarily because it will not have been an evolved system that came together over time with a consistent view of the foibles and the great joys of being human, but also the great foibles of being human, and to be able to understand those and relate to those closely. What makes our Buddhist teachers, I think, as effective as they are, is that they're flawed. If they were absolutely perfect, they could never understand us. I mean, the Buddha had to go through many, many lifetimes of screwing up. And, you know, it's wonderful to read stories about him and Yasodhara in a previous life, where one of my favorite ones is where they're poor, they hardly have anything to eat, and she catches a lizard and they want to cook it for lunch, but she wants to add a few grains of rice to it to make it a stew. And she says, I'm going to go to the market. Now you watch and make sure that the water doesn't boil out of the pot and the lizard is cooked properly. And in his previous incarnation, the Buddha can't quite resist its spell. So he takes one bite, he takes another bite. Pretty soon he realizes he's eaten the whole thing. All that's left is a skeleton, and he doesn't know what to do. So he throws the skeleton out into the forest. And when Yasodhara comes back, she says, where's the lizard? He says, it jumped out of the pot and ran away. So that's the story. And the frame story is one of the Buddha's disciples is asking him in his life as Siddhartha Gautama, is asking him, why when you do Dharma talks, does Yasodhara always get this funny frown on her face? That's the story that explains it. And so I think, we human beings, we learn from our mistakes. We don't always learn from mistakes, and we don't always have to learn only from mistakes. But if we've never made mistakes, I don't know that we can understand other people making the mistakes. And if an AI system is not made aware of mistaking, of going wrong, of having to improve, then it really is just a machine system, and it's not alive. Because I think one of the things that separates, I think was it Bob who asked the question, going back to single sort of organisms and evolving up to the present, everything that has been evolving sentiently has been on a track of improvement, not just success. If it was just about survival, succeeding and surviving, we would have never gone beyond one cell, because that's plenty enough. You don't need anything more. Or we could have gotten to be cockroaches, and you don't need any more because they've been around for 1 billion years now and probably will be around a lot more. I mean, evolution could have stopped. And what's kept it moving is consciousness is continually figuring out new ways of cohering, different ways of cohering, and also differentiating creatively to try to improve, to enhance the kinds of relations that are playing out visually, auditorily, in terms of smell and taste and touch and bodily presence and cognition and all the rest of it. It's a magical improvisational thing that's been going on. So I think AI Buddhist teachers will not have participated in that karmically. I just don't know that they would ever be able to give us truly.
Let me see if I can mute this person. There we go. Yeah, I don't see how they would.
There's Roshi bot. Someone's posted
Yeah,
an AI bot in the chat.
yeah, that's in
Well,
Lions Roar magazine had an article on that.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't see how these AI gurus or teachers would have the capacity to develop the cities, for example, precognition, clairvoyance. How would a machine learning system develop those?
I think that a machine learning system would need to develop basic subjective presence first, would really need to have the seventh consciousness. And I think that it's theorized in Yogacara as Klistamanas, not because it's always great, because it's problematic. That self-consciousness, subjective self-awareness comes along with the conception of self that leads us to conflict. And so that's part of the package. You don't get the compassion without having understood the suffering to which compassion is a response. And we've evolved to be able to do that. We've evolved to the point that we can be compassionate. I don't see an AI doing that. So I don't see AIs developing cities and so on, because they're success-oriented. They will give a response that gets the job done. But that's it. So taking it one step further, why would they? I mean, right now, machine systems are not intentional beings. They don't have freedom of intention. They're totally programmed. And any illusion of intention is a function of the way in which they've been programmed. It's an accident of their combination statistically of stuff that human beings have generated. So it's, at this point, still simulation of human intelligence. But as I said, with these systems that pass the mirror self-recognition test, as those are combined with large language models and so on, and robotic systems that move around the world that we inhabit, I think things are going to change, and they're going to change very rapidly. Then we may have intentional AI in a way that's recognizable. And when AI starts to develop its own intentions, how do we deal with them? It's like your kids developing their own minds. At some point, you need to let them go and make their own decisions. But as a parent, you do an awful lot of hard work trying to make sure they got the right values and basic worldview that'll help them behave accordingly. And I think we ought to be training AI in much the same way we take care of our kids, making sure that as they're developing, they develop some good habits.
That's an interesting point, because from what I know about AI, and I don't know hardly anything, is that it started out just training on the web, right? Just started reading everything that's on the internet, and we've learned that the wisdom of crowds is not usually too wise in terms of what's on the internet.
Yeah, I mean, there's
it's-
different kinds of AI, but these machine learning systems, the ones that are like inform ChatGPT, large language models, we just want to be precise and say they don't read. Reading is a human activity. We read. An AI doesn't read. What an AI does is has access to all of the stuff, the data that's in the internet, everything that's digitally available in whatever database it's being trained on. And it simply has access to all of that data. And what it's looking for is correlations between points of data. It's not like reading a text.
Mm-hmm. When you say being trained on, they're being trained on by people who are creating certain criteria about what they should be trained on, right?
For
I
sure.
mean, can you say more about that, and how do the biases factor into that?
Well, as any AI person will tell you in terms of training data, garbage in, garbage out. If you don't have good data, you get funny results. So one of the big problems, for example, in using AI systems for recommending students for university acceptance, that became a really big deal about maybe 8 years ago, 7, 8 years ago. Lots of universities started doing it because it's really cheap. It, and quote, goes through the reads and quote, goes through the application, sorts out the applications according to measures that they've been given for success of study. And so for engineering students, one of the criteria for success was being male. Why was that? Because historically, up until quite recently, engineers were almost all men. So if you look at the historical data, the data will tell you most engineers are men. This woman applying for a graduate degree in engineering is probably not as good as the man simply because of that. Huge problem, which then had to be corrected. If you're looking at the way it's being used in the criminal justice system, AI is being used to do sentencing and parole requirements for people who are in the court system. Okay, it can save some time, and the AI will not be before lunch giving out quick, rapid judgments because the judge is hungry. Okay, so it's good AI doesn't get hungry. But if you look at the historical data of racism in the United States, you look at incarceration rates, you look at recidivism rates, and you say, if you are just taking the data, looking only at the data, you will say a white criminal being sent to prison is less likely to engage in recidivistic activities afterward than a black one. Therefore, the black one gets a higher sentence. Why? Because historically, under conditions of end of slavery, discrimination in terms of where you can live within a city, the redlining policies that concentrated the poor blacks in one area, all these different historical facts are embedded in that data set, not explicitly, but implicitly. And an AI is insensitive to it totally. So what you need to get good AI, good machine learning systems, is people who understand themselves the world that they're designing the system to perform in and what values need to be prioritized. Unfortunately, most of the people that are doing that programming are not people with that kind of knowledge. They're people who are really good at math and computational stuff. They tend to be male. They tend to be young. They tend to be introverted. They tend not to be outgoing, artistic, culturally creative people who love engaging others in conversation or pursue Dharma studies and so on. They're not. And when I've asked people at AI meetings what they think is the solution, they say, you tell me what ethics to build into the system, I'll figure out how to build it in. Do not ask me to figure out the ethics. That's not what I do. So I think part of what we're talking about is real collaborative work where people from a wide range of disciplines and backgrounds, historical perspectives are brought into the design process very early on in the development, not just of the objective functions that get built into the machine learning systems, but that also identify what the appropriate training data sets are, allow them to be a part of the process, deciding how to perfect those training data sets over time and so on. So there's a huge amount of room for improvement on it.
Yeah, that's really scary to me that that professionals would put so much trust in even these early systems that have these value blind spots.
I mean, the efficiencies are huge. I mean, it's just like the ChatGPT system. True confessions. My younger son doing his neuroscience degree at USC, University of Southern California, thinking about grad school and doing a PhD. He's doing a research project where part of what he's supposed to be doing is looking for evidence that things like binaural beats or cranial stimulation that could be appropriate with putting that together with an app might improve concentration. How is he going about doing it? I asked him. And he says, well, I designed a questionnaire. I give the questionnaire to ChatGPT-4. I give it a list of articles that I did through a library search. I have it read the articles and report on only the ones that meet the criteria that I've selected and that answer the questions in a way that's sufficiently that I then know to go read the abstract or the article. And I said, do you have any idea how much knowledge you're missing out on by reading the articles yourself? Because half of what really becomes so important for you, you don't get because you ask the right questions. You get it accidentally. It happens along the way. And you're suddenly struck by a book that you see on the shelf that you never would have looked for. And you look and you open the page and go, wow, that's the answer to my senior thesis right there. Serendipity. I mean, you miss that kind of knowledge if you're not reading at all. So when he asked, well, what do you do when you're writing a book? I said, I start with reading about 6,000 pages. And then I draft a basic, here's what I'm going to write. I try to do the first paragraph, and I end up reading another 6, 8, 10,000 pages along the way. It's a lot of research. But when you're done, you know a lot. Getting ChatGPT to write the book for you, you're not going to learn much. I see a hand up by Beth.
Yeah, hi, thank you. And this talk is really fascinating. So this is you kind of led into what I was wondering about, which is, I think of like the Buddha trying to wake us up from all our delusions. And what's our best way, do you feel, to interact with like the digital natives? I love that phrase. Like what can we offer besides modeling, I think, to try to wake up people from the digital case they were born into?
Yeah, I think part of it is building the kind of deep, very full relational bandwidth connections with people. When I say full relational bandwidth, I mentioned it earlier. It's like, here we only have visual and sound. If you're present in a room with people, like you walk into a room where somebody's just had an argument, you might not hear the argument, but there's something in the air. You definitely sense the emotional tension. It could be pheromones, chemicals in the air, what have you, but we sense things like that. Developing a relationship with people that are digital native and bringing them down to the time speed, the time scale in which the present moment expands. I think that's really crucial. And that places really high demands on us because it's like trying to work with my younger, I've got a son that's 44 and a son that's 22. So different generation. And I have to relate somewhat differently to the two of them. To capture my younger son's attention requires a different kind of presence. I really need to focus it down, connect with him. Maybe it's physical. It might be I have to put my hand on his shoulder, might have to give him a hug to get him like into the moment and then start talking to him. But I think a lot of it is inviting them to express their own reservations about the systems that they're in, because they mostly have them. I don't know any young person that's so immersed that they don't feel that somehow life wouldn't be better if it was less digital. That they really are convinced that there's something that they're missing, but they don't have an alternative because all their friends are doing it. Their social life depends on it. And if there was one quality that I think we could try to instill in them, and this is something that I think people can be made to appreciate, and that's commitment. Committing to doing things.
Mhm.
You know, I was recently talking to somebody who's been doing Vipassana training, and she's from Bangladesh, been doing it for about 1.5 years. She says, the longest I can do is a week of everyday practice for half an hour in the morning. And then things happen, and I just do other things, and I get distracted. And I said, well, how committed are you to it? Have you committed to doing it every day? Maybe not 30 minutes. Take just 15 minutes a day, every day for a month. Just tell yourself you're going to do it, and then do it. Carry out. For young people, it's like you set an appointment to go to the beach with somebody, to go surfing, to hang out. Follow through on it. Don't call them up last minute and say, I changed my mind because something better came. Commit. And then I think the relationships that they have with their world, whether it's the beach for surfing, whether it's the friends, whether it's parents, whether it's school, it's anything, those relationships will deepen. You know, for me, the ultimate sort of basis of thinking, how do we move forward, is think, well, what does it take to be a bodhisattva? Just read the classical text. What does it take? You have to make a vow. You have to vow that no matter what, you've got a skill for medicine. If I can use my medical skill to relieve the suffering of sentient beings, I will use this until all sentient beings have been relieved of physical suffering. It's a vow, it's a commitment. And that gives them the upaya to be able to do that. So I think that as young people discover that by making commitments and of offering things to others, they will be given more opportunity to offer, and that cycle of offering and reception will amplify, and it'll amplify in ways they never could have imagined, and they're on their own, they're on their way. I don't think we can do much more.
Yeah, it's kind of back to the paramitas in a way,
Yeah.
to bring them back. Yeah. And I like that idea of the digital ambivalence too, that you can tap into that. I think that's true. I think there's
Yeah.
something there. Yeah, thanks a lot.
Yeah, you know, I'm sorry that there's no simple answer to that. It's like, here's the fix that's gonna
No,
take care
I
of
don't
it.
expect that. Yeah. Not
They
at
don't
all.
exist. Yeah.
No, not at all. Thanks.
Richard,
Richard?
you had your hand up?
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, I mean, you've been talking a lot about humanity. Actually, I wonder if the most useful way to approach this with regard to AI is to talk about common sense. You know, I was in prepping for this because, you know, I knew this AI talk was coming up. I found this piece on YouTube about AI and common sense, and it was really, really revealing. Because I understand now that AIs are not anymore being just trained with large language models. They now have specialist trainers to try and train them, because they make these elementary mistakes. Like, if you want to stop everyone suffering, kill everyone would be a nice one. You know, that would stop them suffering. And so AI doesn't have that. And that to me is back to this same point. AI has a lot of share-up, but no yeshi. It has no common sense. And as far as I can see, there's no chance of it getting any common sense, because it seems to me that's something entirely different from correlative knowledge. And correlative knowledge, as you say, just takes you down a cone of where you started, just like your son's research. And what you're relying on when you read 6,000 books is yeshi to go along in the background and suddenly go, hey, look at that. Hey, look at that. Which is stuff that really is not conscious. It's something else. And
Right.
to me, this is the essence of humanity. And I'm not myself convinced at all that AI is even on the road to it, never mind about breaking through to it. I don't see how, because it seems to me that the way it works is through correlation, and this stuff is not correlative in that manner. And I'd be
Yeah,
interested
and
in you feel. I mean, I'm not an AI pro, so I really have no.
Yeah, I think up until now, what you're saying is absolutely right. And there's a very well-known ethicist working at Oxford named Luciano Floridi, who even goes a step further, and he says AI systems aren't even intelligent. You know, he wants to push that really far. But things are changing really rapidly. And one of the reasons why AI systems don't have what we would call common sense is because they don't have a world model. We develop our world models as we're growing up. It's one of the great things about culture is it gives us a world model. It's also one of the terrible things about culture is it gives us a world model. And people who are bicultural are really different. They tend to deal better with diversity. They tend to be in some ways more creative because they have two cultural infrastructures that they're familiar with and move between. People who learn multiple languages, similar sorts of gains from that. AIs don't have world modeling capabilities that are very sophisticated at this point. Part of that's the memory problem. When I mentioned earlier building a bicameral AI that would have a large language model as one hemisphere of its quote computational brain, and having the other one equipped with a full three-dimensional memory system that also plays an adversarial role vis-a-vis the large language model. So using memory and adversarial AI means it checks the results of what's coming out of the large language model, tells the large language model you're not doing good enough based on this. Right now, you're right, human beings are performing that function because we're the only ones that have the common sense. But people are actively working on building systems to develop world modeling capability. In Japan, they've built systems, computer systems, computational systems that engage in counterfactual logic and that imagine alternatives. They imagine alternative realities. It's a little bit like what in a machine learning system that's trying to predict whether a new molecule will have cancer treatment capabilities, which AIs have proven very, very good at doing, finding new molecules, because it's about pattern recognition. It doesn't take any common sense, but they're really good at that. But if you combine that capability with the system that allows the AI to be trained to develop a better sense of what's going on, and that modeling is updated continually, which is what we do. We update our models all the time. My model when I was 14 years old was somebody gets in your face, you push them. Somebody gets in your face twice, you don't wait for them to swing, you swing first, because once the swings get started, it's all over. I was in an environment that was not a friendly environment. Fighting was part of the day-to-day deal, and you had to either be good at it or figure out how to avoid it. I discovered when I went to college, this didn't work very well. It was like, change my reality. And that's what AIs are not doing. They're not able to model the world, model a change taking place, adjust their model accordingly, update their processing in order to do that. But people are working on it.
Right,
And so I think
we've heard of
in the
people
next,
working on it for a long time.
no, we can't discount what's really happened in the last 10 years.
Okay.
Because although machine learning systems, the viability of machine learning techniques was proven in the late 1960s. What kept it from working was the fact that the computers were so slow. The computer systems themselves had so little memory that you couldn't get the machine learning system to do anything effective. What's in your smartphone today is a more powerful computer than existed anywhere in the world in the 1980s. Anywhere in the world. It's an astonishing change technologically. So that's what's made this kind of AI possible. Without the hardware change, none of this would be happening. So you're right that the ideas are old. People have been working on it for a while, but it took a while for the software, the hardware to get together. And then what we now have is not systems that need to be told how to learn. I mean, what was astonishing to people in China, and the reason why China jumped on the AI sort of bandwagon and said, we're going to be a leader in AI by 2030, was when the AlphaGo system defeated the world champion Go player. Because the number of moves in the game of Go, if every move was a particle, an electron or a proton or a neutron, there are more moves in the game of Go than there are particles in the universe. There's no way you can compute yourself to playing the game. You can't map out the moves and the consequences of the moves. The decision tree is too huge. You need to develop a sense of how the game works. The first model of Go, AlphaGo, was trained on human games, and then it played itself millions of times. The second version of it was given no instructions. It was simply given the game board and told to play, to figure it out. It trained itself with no game, no history, no rules, learned to do it itself. That version was able, AlphaGo, the initial one, would beat humans 100 times to 1. Humans could still win. The new version beats the old version all the time. The old version can't win against the new one. The new one wins that, it plays that much better. It's learned that much more effectively. Now it's really narrow. That system can only play Go. It can't cook a hamburger. It can't drive a car. It can't diagnose cancer. It can't read an X-ray. It can't do anything except play Go. So the next step is when they start connecting these systems so that a system like that plays Go has developed strategy in that context is going to be hooked up to a military AI that's trying to figure out battlefield positions. And they use those two things together. This is one of the things the Chinese are doing. You put those two systems together and they can do things that neither system can do alone. So yes, now, nothing like common sense. Soon, I'm afraid it may be sooner than we would like to hope. When I wrote the book, Buddhism and Intelligent Technology, most of the writing was done in 2018, 2019. The book came out in 2021. I thought we had 15 years to get our act together as humanity. I don't think we have 15 years now. I think we have more like 5 or at most 8 before the systems have developed so fast that their wish-fulfilling capacity to mirror what humanity wants, what humanity desires, what we fear, is going to be at the point where we really are running out of maneuvering space ourselves. I'm really concerned about that.
But Peter, I mean, honestly, if you're correct, then there is no, I mean, there's no ethical guidelines that make any sense whatsoever because,
you know, and what's worrying is a company like Google will hire an ethicist and they get an ethics board and then they fire the person as soon as the ethics says,
Yeah, remember Tristan Harris.
What you're doing, Google, is not ethical. What you're doing is violating, this and that and the other basic principles, and Google fired the person.
Of course.
Howard, you have your hand up. Howard.
Yes, I wanted to ask you because I've been reading Mustafa Suleyman, who wrote a book, The Coming Wave, and also listening to Geoffrey Hinton, who left Google. And I gather there is no real chance of containment, that this is moving ahead at the rate that commercial enterprises want to move as quickly as they can. The regulators are, being lobbied to death. The Congress doesn't even understand anything about this technology. And do you see any hope of containing this?
Well, I think that the containment issue is partly dealing with the data sphere in an appropriate way. Because right now, everything that we do digitally, it's a record of human intelligence in action. It's something we valued. It shows up. That's the only reason it shows up. The data sphere is a record of things humans have valued enough to measure in some way to get a data point. That's what data is. The data sphere is a sphere of potential resonances, connections, significances. That's why when a machine learning system is given a really big data set, it comes through that and finds all the correlations, the connections that resonate to be able to solve whatever problem it's been given. Right now, the data sphere is run by corporations. They own the data. So Google has its data set that it's training its large language model on. OpenAI has its. Meta, Facebook has its model. The Chinese government has its model. There's different systems out there, and they're all sort of in their own little units. We don't really, at this point, have a completely open data sphere. So it's already sort of balkanized, and that's a problem. Because if you combined all the data, if you had health data from Africa and Asia, as well as Latin America and North America and Europe, and the Pacific Islands. You get all the major world regions, all the data, and you had an AI that was looking for health solutions, it would be much more effective than one that's only got US data or European data or African data, because human beings are different culturally, genetically, etc. So one thing that we could do is we could start lobbying for, one, a change of the regime of data regulation. Right now, when you use the internet, anything you do digitally in Europe, you have to accept that you're going to accept their cookies, or you set your own cookies, you accept the uses of their data, or you opt out of the data use. And most people just click through because they don't have the time. They just want to find shoes. They just want to watch a video. They don't want to deal with all this stuff. And anyway, what's my data worth anyway to who? But the secret is that these machine learning systems that the corporations are using, that are making AI develop faster, 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 so we might be running out of time more quickly than we think. If they have access to our data, they're in charge of deciding which algorithms run on it. We could have a different system. We could have a system where your data, everything you do online, is sent to a data repository, a data system that has a responsibility, like a fiduciary responsibility for your data. It's like putting your money in a savings credit union. The credit union can only invest your money in things that the members of the credit union think are legitimate investments. Okay? A data collective would operate the same way. Your data goes to the collective. The data collective holds your data. Your data doesn't go anywhere else. If someone wants to use your data, they have to get access to the data collective, and the data collective determines which algorithms get access to your data. Data collectives can then say, the data, well, the people who belong to this collective will only be used for medical purposes. Or you could say they'll only be used to meet the Millennium Development Goals, or it'll only be used to reduce poverty, whatever. You could have a range of things that the data collective will allow the data to be accessed for. But your data doesn't move, it remains yours. And if you decide to put it in a different data collective, because your collective is not performing the way you want, you just move your data. Your data belongs to you. This is not the regime we have now. And what we would need is a global governance regime to allow data cooperatives like that, data collectives to run, and to have that responsibility, so that the algorithms have to be vetted by people who, to address the question that Richard had earlier about people deciding which data sets and what data to use and how to correct for problems within the data. That's the data collective's job. So we could have a different regulatory regime. All of it's completely feasible technically. They've been beta testing the data collective idea at MIT. It's possible, it works. We just need a mass movement of people to say, I'm going to stop using Facebook until Facebook allows me to keep all of my data and to put it in the collective I want. I'm going to stop posting to Instagram. I'm going to do it for a week until the US government steps in and starts to make a change here. Right now, we have leverage because the existing systems of AI require more human data to train on to get better. Their depth of intelligence depends on our data. We don't feed them data, they don't get any better. So we do have leverage to that extent. Where the possibility for that changing and how fast it'll happen, I don't know. But of course, people are trying to figure out ways to get around that dependency. And so they're now developing AI systems that will create artificial data, that will synthesize data so that new systems can be built on synthetic data.
Oh my,
I don't know how well that'll work, how feasible it will be.
that
and
sounds
what-
even more dangerous.
It certainly is. But this is the kind of thing corporations do when they start to get desperate. And so I think that we really need to go to our governments, to civil society, and to start making much more strenuous demands that the problems aren't about privacy. The problems aren't about accountability. The problems really are these social big problems that we can only address if we create AI systems that really are designed from the ground up to be humane.
So
not
what you're
just
saying
boards.
is, how do we democratize this whole AI
Yeah.
development?
It's part about democracy, but I'm of mixed feelings about democracies, to be honest with you. For the simple reason that unless you've got a great education system
Yeah.
and you raise a population to be critical, thoughtful, caring, loving, and compassionate in all circumstances, I don't know, people in the United States, they vote for what? They vote for how their wallet's affected, how much taxes, it's an issue, borderline crossings. I mean, most Americans, quite frankly, they're just not sophisticated enough. So I do think that it needs to be a movement that comes from people who do have knowledge and who can get other people on board, and to take something like the discussion we've been having, which maybe those of you who are here and who might, watch online, I mean, maybe you get it, but for a young audience, it would be much better put into a video. It would be much better put into some kind of an animated thing with good music to go along with it. It could be a blockbuster movie. It could be a great novel, a manga, animated, what do they call those things? Visual novels with pictures.
Graphic novels, graphic.
novels. I mean, that's what we need. And so maybe we're not the people who do that, but we should be trying to partner, create collaborations between people who are the creatives, people who have the incentives, people who know young people, and to get the word out and do something really different. It's got to be intergenerational. It's got to be international, intercultural. Yeah, nobody's going to do it on.
But Peter, surely you just said the Chinese government are already linking AIs to killing machines. There is not a
So is the
chance
US.
that this is going to work. Because clearly, if this technology can do that, then it's going to develop out of control, because everybody's got to have the worst of it, because the other guy's got the worst of it. This is how it goes, right? With every
Yeah.
The arms race, yes.
In the War College,
there's already an AI arms race.
in the
And didn't
War
I
College
hear
a
that
few
the
years
US
ago,
government refused to share? There was a talk about some kind of digital agreement with China, and there was a refusal, because currently we have a head start over the Chinese and people want to preserve it. Obviously, you start sharing, then you're sharing with bad actors to whom you give your data.
Mistrust.
Mistrust.
And I think that, again, we can continue with the balkanization of the data sphere and a global governance on data, and then we get performance fall off. AI is not going to do as good as it could. But one government system for everybody, Chinese or American, I think that would be just as disastrous. But the Cold War mentality has been bought into by both the US and the Chinese. Both of them are talking about it as a new arms race, an AI arms race. And there's only two results to an arms race: checkmate and stalemate. Those are the only two options, and neither one of them is good in this case. So what we need to argue against is that mentality. But the US, War College had a big thing on AI a couple of years ago where the basic statement was, look, it no longer makes sense to send missiles into another country and bomb it, because you can destabilize a population much more effectively using AI, using, mass techniques of influence that are already being used by governments and non-state actors and so on, by corporations, to influence populations in ways that we can destabilize governments without the expenditure, without the loss of life, and looking like we're good guys, because it can all be done behind the scenes. I mean, we have
AI psyops, AI
really,
psyops.
Exactly. I mean, and this is, I think, I was invited to give some feedback to a Department of Defense group that was designing an algorithm machine learning system to scrape the Chinese web to be able to gauge mood of the Chinese population. And it's like, okay, so what is the values that you're looking for? What's the objective function? I just found it astonishing. It was simplistically scary. It was just frightening to think, this is what you think you can get real opinion out of people in China? Do you understand anything about how the way the Chinese language works? and about the way in which people get around state surveillance by making use of the multivalence of the Chinese sound system versus the characters and the meaning. I mean, you've got to, I don't know how you would build a system because that's changing all the time by the population in China. I just don't know how you would build the system to do that. You'd be better off developing good human relations with people so that you get their opinions directly rather than trying to scrape the web for this stuff. But the fascination that AI is going to solve all of our problems. There's a group called C3 AI, and their corporate motto is solving previously unsolvable problems. And that's really the model. That's the poster child theme, solving previously unsolvable problems, including military ones, including capitalist ones, including terrorist ones. I mean, it's why I think we need to move fast. Somehow I went into mute there. Not sure when the mute started, but Richard, you had something more to say?
Yeah, I did. Yeah, just that rather depressingly, the Ukraine war, which, you know, is beginning to look a bit like the Spanish war, is showing that no, AI is really only going to be good if you can stick it in a drone and kill people with it. That's what it's going to be good for, because populations are quite resilient to, once the war starts, they're quite resilient to propaganda that is trying to influence them in a free society. I mean, perhaps in Russia, but even in Russia now, Putin's losing it. So I'd be interested in your view on that. It seems to me that what's really happening in Ukraine, which seems to be a beta test for the weapons industry, is that AI is going to be linked up to drones more and more and more, and mass produced to make more efficient killing machines, which of course is exactly the depressing outcome that one feared, and that's what appears to be happening. And there is the experiment, really.
And what's being used in Ukraine and the Soviet Union are really, really basic. So they're extraordinarily,
basic, aren't they? I thought they were quite
really low, they're really low level drone stuff.
Oh, they are, drones are, yeah. But I mean, aren't they trying?
Oh, they are. But the US and China have systems that operate on swarm consciousness. So you connect these, you have like a group of 10 mini drones that are small enough to where if it's flying around, you can't see it. So you're talking about the size of a dragonfly that can nevertheless deliver lethal, like a shot, an injection. You zero in on a target, you decide where you're going to go. They don't all go at once. They take different routes so that they're all coordinating with one another. And if one of them is threatened and knocked out, they change their network ability to zero in on the target, find the target, annihilate. I mean, people are working on stuff like this. And, you know, the general public might think, nobody's ever going to use it. Well, they're already using it in Ukraine. Not that level of sophistication, but they're already using it. And from the Chinese side, I mean, it's really clear. You can have an autonomous weapon system that can identify a target, aim, hit the target in a matter of milliseconds. The human brain, our infrastructure, our neural infrastructure, doesn't allow us to process things that takes place faster than 40 milliseconds. That's sort of hardwired into our infrastructure. And it's good because you need a bit of a gap time to correlate visual data that's coming at light speed and sound that's coming at only 800 miles an hour, electrical conduits. I mean, there's a reason why our infrastructure is the way it is. But you can get an AI system that can do the entire thing of orient in the environment, decide what to do, act on what you decided in less time than it takes the human to even see the target. There's no way that they're not going to eventually use this stuff. And the scary thing is what's been going on in the United States and in China, to a lesser degree, China, more in the United States, is talking about the potential of war with China. building up the possibility of a war because of Taiwan and so on and so forth, when instead they should be really strenuously working to figure out, how do we keep from doing that? How do we not do that? And, my interest in technology went back to 1964. And I read a book when I was 10 years old, my father's book, Nuclear Arms and Disarmament. It was written by the Rand Corporation. And I was stunned to find out as a 10-year-old that what human adults had come up with as the best possible plan for dealing with nuclear arms and disarmament was the plan called MAD, M-A-D, Mutually Assured Destruction. And I thought as a 10-year-old, if this is what the best and the brightest in this world are doing, I want to live in a different world. That's when I started reading about meditation, interest in psychedelics, getting out of this space, because the people that are running this world are they're off their rockers. And they're still there and they're still running. So I think that those of us in this space, you wouldn't be in this space if you didn't have better intentions than those. So I just think that the values and intentions of people like us need to be put more into the public sphere. And it's one of the reasons I think Buddhism should be in the public sphere fully, because it's one of the few self-consistent systems that helps us think about these things critically and gives us the resources that we need attentionally to be able to deal with this new world that we're in. I just think it's a perfect time for Buddhism.
But in a way, aren't you saying it's just the old world we're in? Really, what we're basically saying is that Buddhist values, whether you're fighting with bows and arrows or AI, ultimately
It's just
come down to the same
time
thing.
speed. It's the same thing, but the time factor is really different.
Yeah, it's
AI
just
scales
worse.
up the time factor.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah,
Because in
and
many
the
ways,
degree of,
but this is where you get the problem. You see, so many of these things are because of contingency.
Yeah.
That MAD is perfectly rational. If the other guy's got it, I've got to have it. And unfortunately, that has been the way forever.
Yeah.
And unless you say, well, I'm not going to have it. And then you get a guy like Putin who says, thanks, I'm going to invade.
Yeah.
I got to have it then, haven't I? Because what do I do? And there's your problem. And it seems to me that you inevitably end up with MAD. That's the only one that works. And I haven't seen an alternative apart from saying, is that skillful? But Buddha himself, good Lord, there was genocidal war going on all around him.
Yeah.
He didn't manage to stop one of them. Actually, they all happened. He wasn't successful in stopping
The thing is
serious wars happening during his
we're lucky
lifetime.
that we've had 2,500 years to build on his insights and teachings.
You think we could do better?
Right.
Not so sure.
I think so. Yeah.
Well-
Otherwise, I'd be pessimistic.
Oh, you can always be optimistic.
Let's
I'm
end on a positive
I'm
note here.
reservedly optimistic. I do have some reservations.
Well, I want to thank Peter so much for really the generosity of giving your time here tonight for us here, and thank everyone who has participated in this seminar. We are hoping to, we're not hoping, we are going to continue these monthly. And I just want to again thank you, Peter. And I put in the chat a link to your new book on consciousness.
Okay.
And I just want to make an announcement that we are having another seminar like this in February, February 23rd, with Dr. Peter Fenner, who is a non-duality teacher and a longtime Buddhist teacher. But that will be from 4 to 6 p.m. It'll be a bit earlier than we did tonight. It's called Dancing in the Totality, and you can register for that. Also like to put in a plug for the Time-Space Knowledge class coming up in a few weeks, starting on January 24th, Wednesday mornings from 9:30 a.m. to 11 on Zoom. And I'm co-teaching that with a very senior TSK teacher, Bob Pasternak, who was in the first TSK program back in the late 70s. So that's enough of the commercials. Again, I'd like to thank you, Peter, so much. And if you come back to San Francisco, we're going to have to hang out again. And,
Sounds good.
Yeah.
And I put my personal email into the chat, so if anybody wants to write and follow up with stuff, if you've got questions or anything, feel free. And thanks for having me join you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Peter.
Bye.